Welcome to Diabreadic, the podcast where a T1D artist and T1D expert come together to bake some bread, and then we break bread with smart and interesting people as we talk through the human in health and technology. I'm Stephen Horrocks, a PhD and expert in experiences with diabetes and devices.
I'm Melissa Horrocks. I am a creator, baker, maker of all things, and I am a type 1 diabetic.
And we are back finally with season 1, episode 3.
A long break.
Long break, and we'll talk a little bit about that.
Life.
A lot of life. But we have episode 3 here, Everything Bagel Pumpkin Bread. Long overdue discussion because we made this like ages ago. And Diabetes and its treatments, a primer.
Yeah.
So join us. This will be a fun one. And our guest today is us because we're smart and interesting people too.
We keep telling ourselves that. Okay, so let's talk about this bread that we made back in November?
November.
It was November.
I mean, it was a long time ago, but not that long ago.
I mean, pumpkin bread is kind of all the time, right? And it
Sure.
was it flavored?
No.
Okay, no, it was just like an olive oil bread, but we made it look like a pumpkin.
It's shaped like a pumpkin.
Really cute. We ran into some snags a little bit with the twine. I guess we can get to that in a bit. Do you want to give us the deets of the bread?
Absolutely. So this, we refer to this as Everything Bagel Pumpkin Bread, partly because we didn't know exactly how to what to call this thing, but it is a pretty basic straight dough. So we're talking about bread flour, not any whole wheat flour and stuff mixed in, salt, yeast, water, and some olive oil. And that's the entire kind of contents of the dough. So no pumpkin in there. But the thing that set it apart, especially in terms of the flavor and the bake, was the Everything Bagel seasoning. So this stuff's
so good.
Fantastic. It's so good. We've used it on a number of things. Ironically, never bagels, because we haven't made bagels before, and maybe we'll have to do that.
Another episode.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk bagels at some point.
I think we have made bagels before. I feel like ages ago, but they weren't good. This is before your intro into actual
made pretzels,
bread making.
And that's it's close on the process, kind of. I don't think we've ever actually made bagels.
Well, that seems like a travesty.
I know. But the seasoning is super salty and savory, and so it really, frankly, it's like the star of the show here, and it has onion flecks. I'll call them flecks. Why not? Things like garlic salt or garlic powder, but importantly, it also has sesame seeds, and the seeds. I think it also has poppy seeds in this one too. But
yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there.
The seeds toast in there while it's baking, and so the flavor gets really intense. And so there were a couple of things here that I think were the trick to this bread working and it being so tasty. For one thing, you got to get this stuff to stick on the outside somehow. If you've ever made bread and you have shaped up a loaf of bread, the outside, if we were to just sprinkle the stuff on there, it would just fall right off. And I've done that before.
Kind of if you ever decorate a cookie and try and put sprinkles on minutes later, and they're not going to stick.
They just
it's
fly
a dry
everywhere.
surface, so
yeah, exactly.
Need a wet surface.
So there are a number of ways to do that. Our favorite way, and the way that worked super well for this, is to get a towel. This is actually a trick I learned from Jack Sturgess. Go check out Bake with Jack because he's awesome. But to get a clean kitchen towel and get it damp and lay it flat. And then after you shape up this round, because we just made a ball, after you shape it up, roll it around on that wet paper, not paper towel, regular kitchen towel. Roll it around on there so the whole thing is just a little bit damp and it gets kind of tacky. And then you can just toss the seasoning in a bowl and put the loaf in there. And swash it around.
I love when Steve talks about Oh, I just make a ball of dough. There are like very specific ways. I mean, okay, you can just make it a ball and it'll turn out fine. But there are also these like techniques that he just whips out. He's like, oh, just make a ball. And so I make a ball and then it's like not good. And then he just like does all these maneuvers really fast and it looks amazing. So there are a lot of amazing YouTube videos and things online that Steve's constantly watching, nerding out on, that show some really cool techniques. So Steve can link some of those kind of,
we can put some of those in the show notes.
Some of his favorite YouTubers that
for sure
we have on repeat over here.
YouTube and Instagram, because there are a number of people who kind of do one or the other. And so shaping can be a big deal. Especially with like really finicky doughs, it can be a pretty big deal. For the most part, if it's more or less shaped the way that you want it to be, though, it's going to work, especially with something like this because of the twine. So this is what we haven't talked about. So we shaped these in a ball, but that doesn't look like a pumpkin, right? So what we did was get some kitchen twine, and you might have seen this around, and some of the, these got really popular this past fall. Because the fall before that, there were a handful of people that were doing it and they were like, ooh, cool. But you get some kitchen twine. Stop. You get some kitchen twine, cut them at a length that will go around the loaf plus a few inches. And I think we did 3 of those per mini loaf because these were smaller, but you can do 4 if you have a big loaf. And lay them on top of each other, crisscross in a radial pattern, like in a circle, and plop that dough on top of there with the top side down. That way you can then bring the edges opposite each other, or the strings opposite each other, together and tie it on the top, and it kind of pulls it all back up into a tighter ball, so that when you then bake it and it puffs, that holds, but it puffs outward in between them. And so you get this like pumpkin-y, you get these little ribs on there, and it's like, it's really cool. Really very cool.
We made the mistake of not wetting the twine.
Yes.
So,
and I think oil might be
maybe.
Trick.
Yeah. So we were giving these to people, and we noticed, did I notice?
Yes, you did.
I noticed that there was like little hairs on them, and I was like, what are these little white hairs? They're like stuck in the dough, and it's the fibers of the twine had come off. And so I spent like an hour
it was absurd
with tweezers pulling out little tiny fibers. Anyway, put some oil on your twine before you tie it up.
Yep.
So,
put a little oil in a bowl.
It's not going to hurt you, but it's not going to feel good having little hairs.
Little fuzzies.
Gross.
On your bread. So toss it, put the oil in a bowl and put your twine in there. And then you can kind of like squeegee them with your finger. Stop with the laughing. You're killing me.
I can't help it.
The
Steve's
visuals
a very animated talker, so when he's describing all these things, he's using his hands and like
that doesn't translate in an audio format. So
we'll need to add some videos of him talking.
Sorry, folks.
They just get me laughing, which is probably not cool either.
So the nice thing about this is kind of regardless of how like overcooked or undercooked you like your bread, because I really like a loaf that is cooked pretty dark. I like the flavor that comes from that kind of browning.
We argue about this a lot.
We have a lot of
it's burnt.
She says it's burnt, and I said brown is not burnt. Brown is flavor. But the nice thing about this is that these loaves are basically encapsulated in this seasoning with all these seeds and onion and garlic and all these other things in there. And so those toast, and you can't really see the surface of the loaf anyway. So at whatever point you like your bread baked, it's going to look well, it's going to look and taste delicious.
Yeah.
So
special tip, slice that up, toast it, and butter it. Oh my gosh, it was so good.
Toasted.
It was so good.
Out of this world.
Kind of tasted like a bagel.
So give it a shot.
Bagel.
Yeah, it does. It tastes like a bagel minus the boil. So
But has the nice, toasty flavor.
Yeah. So give them a try. And hopefully we will be able to make some bread more recent for our next episode here.
Welcome back. So the point of this episode is to kind of go over some of the terms and things about diabetes that we talk about a lot that you may not have a concept for.
Yeah. We're around this all the time. And so the way we talk about things sometimes, there's kind of an in-group language thing going on, some jargon that we may kind of miss explaining.
And, it's interesting. There's a lot of things that Steve will talk about. I've had diabetes for 25 plus years of my life. And is that right? Okay, yeah, 25. I have to rethink.
Wow, that's wild.
I think we've talked about that. But anyway, so there are always things to learn. There are things that I definitely don't know because you just know what surrounds you, right? So there's a lot of things about the history and all the stuff that Steve studied that I'm like, what? Okay, yeah, I guess I sort of knew that, but didn't know it. So,
and likewise, anyway. I don't live with diabetes myself. And so even though I am in close proximity with you and experiencing a lot of those things along with you, I don't experience them myself. And I don't have that lifetime of firsthand kind of embodied knowledge.
Right.
And so most of what I do have is what I am able to read and understand those other ways.
Well, I think it's important to remember that everybody's experience is so different with diabetes. Right. You could have two T1D people who have, had diabetes the same amount of time, had similar usages of pumps and needles and different things, and they can have wildly different experiences. So it's important to remember that when we're talking about it. And, everyone's experience isn't the same. But it is fun to relate to people because there's a lot of things that are very similar that you don't. As a kid, I didn't really have friends with diabetes. I didn't know a lot of people with diabetes. And now with the internet and, Instagram groups and different groups of people who meet over online and stuff, there's a lot more connection with people's experiences. So that's really cool. And a new thing even for me. So
yeah, I mean, when you were diagnosed in those first few years thereafter, it was basically diabetic camp, was the only place that you had
I think there was one other, right? I think there was one other girl our age that had diabetes, but we weren't friends. So we kind of knew, oh, she's the other diabetic girl. And
Interesting.
We did know each other a little bit, but, we weren't hanging out all the time. And,
yeah,
I think different people have different experiences with that, but
for sure. So we will start by talking through a little bit about diabetes, try and then talk through a little bit about the different diagnoses, or different types, different forms, different whatever, and some of the kind of things directly related there, so that as we are talking through with guests and with each other moving forward in these episodes, hopefully there will be a little bit more foundation of the way that we're talking through some of these little differences, or as we reference something that's jargony specific kind of experience to diabetes. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of grounding here.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking back to our last episode, and Dr. Walker was talking about some of the really complex social dynamics of defining differences among and within groups of people with diabetes, type 1, type 2, and some of how that gets really messy and complicated, right? But part of part of the way that we can actually start to unpack that is if we are understanding what those words are referring to and how they're representing people's experiences. So diabetes is actually shorthand. So the actual clinical diagnosis term is diabetes mellitus. And there are a number of types of diabetes mellitus that are common, and then quite a few that are much less common diagnoses. Sure. That we'll at least reference and talk through a little bit. But one of the things that I think is interesting is where these, what these words actually mean.
Steve told me this and I was like, what?
Yes. So diabetes mellitus actually means honey siphon.
So weird. But cool. Yeah. You explained it to me.
And there's a long history behind the dynamics of how these names have changed over time. And so we will have an episode related to the history of diabetes because I think it's fascinating and there's a lot to unpack there. But the reason that this term meaning siphon is part of the definition is because of, as those who have been diagnosed can kind of relate. One of the kind of telltale signs is the way that people have an insatiable thirst and are constantly urinating. Yeah. And so that flow of water through the body, that's where that
it's insane.
Representation siphon comes from.
That's one of the first things my mom noticed. Obviously, I had lost a lot of weight. I was 9 and gotten really thin. But basically, just everything going through me. I would take a drink of something and have to pee immediately. And she was noticing I was in the bathroom all the time. And not just little amounts. It was a lot every time. And she clearly noticed. We took a trip to California. And when you're on a trip, you get Sprite with your Happy Meal or things like that. Or you eat a treat or different things. And it was instant. I took a drink and I was like, I've got to pee. We knew my family always jokes about knowing where all the bathrooms were on our vacation before I was diagnosed because it was just constant. I was 9 years old and wetting the bed, which is super embarrassing, and so, yeah.
Yeah. And at the time, it's not like you knew why that was the case and that your body, it's not like you can help that, obviously.
No, yeah.
And so, so that's where that siphon side of this definition comes from. Honey being the other operative term there, referring to sweetness. And we'll talk a lot about kind of sugar, blood sugar, that kind of language. But one of the reasons why honey was part of this diagnosis language was because of the process by which physicians and or people who are working in that kind of field, studying people and bodies, physiologies, but the actual practices that they used in doing that.
Nuts.
Yeah, because the whole idea was to use all of your senses to get a sense of what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so a key aspect of this was actually tasting patients' urine.
Oh.
And there is an identifiably sweeter attribute, I don't know, to urine of people with high blood glucose. And obviously they didn't know that was the thing at the time. But honey siphon, because it is siphoning those fluids through and it's very sweet. Right? So there are long histories. We're talking thousands of years in some cases, and very well documented for many hundreds. And so we'll come back to that conversation in another episode. For right now, I think it's worth then talking through, okay, so what is identifiable as diabetes mellitus, regardless of the type? Mm-hmm. That is usually characterized by high, and I say abnormally is the language that's usually in medical textbooks. So abnormally high blood glucose levels,
Sure.
regardless of the type. That's the kind of definition marker that gathers all of these very different kinds of embodied experiences under one.
Basically,
definition.
there's not enough insulin to combat those high blood sugars.
Yeah. And in some other cases, some other really complex things going on in the body that makes that happen as well. So let's start with type 1 diabetes, because that's obviously your personal experience and much of my research and personal experience as well. So since you have lived with this forever, right? What is type 1?
It's funny because I have to sit back and type 1, obviously, you don't define it as a definition when you tell people. Usually some people have a context for what diabetes is. We've talked a lot about how that can be varied in accuracy, but basically it's an autoimmune disorder in which your body does not create enough insulin for your body, or no insulin at all, which is type 1. So there's varying amounts of that where we can kind of talk about, 1.5 at gestational. There's different forms of that, but my pancreas does not create the insulin that my body needs to survive.
Yeah. And so that's the shorthand, right? The pancreas does not create insulin anymore, period. The how and why that happens is complicated and interesting. Yep. And some parts of that are still a big question mark. But the key is that your immune system, like the T cells, the things that are actively combating things that shouldn't be in your body, see the beta cells in your pancreas that create insulin and kill them.
Yep.
Kill them off. How that triggers and why has been a major focus of researchers for many, many decades. And there are ways that the people are getting closer to kind of getting a better handle on that. But still, frankly, we don't really know.
It's really crazy.
There are a lot of intersecting factors in triggering that response.
And probably more than one factor, which is probably why it's so hard to really nail down the cause, because there probably are, many different causes in different ways. And so, one reason might not solve all the reasons why. Yeah.
And so, with when we're talking about type 1 and the complete lack of production of insulin, eventually, because it's a process and it kills them off. And so there is a period, usually shortish, where the amount of insulin being produced varies.
Yeah. It's funny, when I was first diagnosed, I don't know if they still do this. They call it the honeymoon period.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking that was so funny, but it was true. I was going low a lot, and they were kind of explaining your body still might be creating some insulin. And so, there's periods of time when you will be going low a lot, and that's really hard and complicated. And I think, insulin's a hormone. And so even in my older age, getting pregnant, there's so many varying things that affect that. And going low, speaking of going low
on that subject, and I think this is important to bring up here as well, because we have referenced already in previous episodes, going high and going low. So let's talk through those just a little bit. And what they are, what that means, but then also what that is like in experience.
It's funny. I keep bringing up all these anecdotes, but my parents, I just remember as a kid, my parents were always like, "Are you high? Are you high?" And as a teenager, that's kind of hilarious to be out in public and have your mom berating you like, "Are you high?" "Melissa, are you high?" Because when I have high blood sugar, that means there's not enough insulin in your body to, combat the blood sugar level. And so you have high blood sugars. There are different side effects of high and low blood sugars. And high blood sugars, for me, often I am grumpy and, I get extra I'm already very A-type, kind of stubborn. And so
Nuh-uh.
those get stop. Those, accentuate, and I think about teenage kids, and then a teenage kid who has high blood sugar, who is, having the effects of that. Anyway, so high blood sugar does not feel good. I mean, I remember one time in college, my insulin pump wasn't in right. The tube had bent or something. And I remember being in class and just starting to feel sick and like have a big headache. I tested and it was like above 600 on my meter. It was horrible. I remember going home and just laying on the couch and just, I think did I call you or did I call my dad? I don't remember who I called, but I think it was my dad. And I was like, I feel like I'm dying. Like, I feel like I just want to die. And that seems dramatic, but it feels horrible. I don't think there's any way you can really describe to someone how it feels necessarily. But you get really thirsty and, you have to pee a lot. There's, lots of different factors that go into it, but it feels terrible. And high blood sugars, people can have high blood sugars that don't quite feel that intensely. And I think the more you're used to those high blood sugars, the less you feel the effects of them immediately, which is why it's so scary, because long term, those can be very dangerous for your body. And, there's lots of different things we can talk about at some point, but
for sure.
Do you have anything to add about high blood sugars?
So not necessarily. Right. But the part that I think you were talking about that is important and interesting, and that we'll have to get to in future episodes more as well, is identifying that insulin is a hormone.
Yeah.
Because when we understand that insulin is a hormone and is no longer being produced by your body, the balance of what's happening inside your body among various hormones is a delicate thing. Yeah. And when the balance of various hormones in your body change, it throws absolutely everything in your body out of whack.
Which can happen day to day, honestly, which is, I think, why it's so hard to manage type 1 diabetes, especially. Diabetes in general, but your hormones are constantly changing. So
for sure.
It's nuts.
And you talked through a couple of examples of how that is particularly true, and there are certain things that need to be navigated, particularly by people who menstruate. And that's a key aspect of this. You mentioned kind of pregnancy as well. But for people who menstruate, there are a number of cyclical changes in hormone balances in your body. Yeah. And that deeply affects how insulin can function in your body at the same time. Yeah. And so that gets really complicated.
It does. I feel like I've, obviously been menstruating most of my life and still cannot figure out how to manage that.
Yeah.
Because it's different every time.
Exactly. So, and at the extreme level, high blood glucose can lead to what is referred to as DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis, where, basically the blood becomes toxic because of the amount of glucose there that can't be used in your body's cells, because there's no insulin to kind of be the key to those cells and say, here, glucose, go here. And so it gets very, very dangerous. And oftentimes people who are in DKA have to spend, in some cases, several days in the hospital recovering because it can be really severe. Yeah. So on the flip side of that, we also refer to being low, or lows, low blood sugar, low blood glucose.
Yeah. So low blood sugars are really scary sometimes. When we first moved out to Indiana about a decade ago, which is nuts, I was sort of diagnosed with hypo-unawareness, which basically I've just thought for a long time, I can go really low before I feel the effects of it. And so then there's this really quick, all of a sudden, I'm like far gone. And so I have these kind of scary lows in which I didn't necessarily feel it when I was, in the 70s or 80s blood sugar. And so then I would get down to 30 or 40 before I all of a sudden was like, crap, I'm low. So I have lots of crazy low stories. Maybe we'll do an episode sometime about low stories because yikes. But basically your body just stops functioning in the way it's supposed to. You feel confused. I often describe it to Steve as I can't connect in my brain from point A to point B. It's like this weird, like misfiring in your brain where you can't like function. But you shaky, heat. I start sweating, get really confused. And it's weird. And I feel like I try to act normal and I try to act like I'm normal. Obviously people notice I'm not. Anyway, what else? Oh man. Sometimes, you can seize, you can pass out.
And so that's when it gets especially scary as someone who is a partner of someone with type 1.
Sure.
Extreme lows do happen, regardless of the kind of general practices and well-being of people. Lows and highs happen. And
for a myriad amount of reasons,
tons.
Too much insulin, you've exercised and, gone low. You didn't eat enough for what you bolused for.
Extra stress happened to creep up. And that's, again, we're talking about the balance of hormones in your body. And so there are tons of things that can affect that. And the loss of consciousness and loss of use of your limbs and parts of your body are the most like immediately terrifying things.
Yeah.
Both for me, like as someone with you and trying to help you through that. And I'm sure also the person actually going through
it's terrifying, especially, I've had several times in which I have lost consciousness and waking up from that is really terrifying because you obviously don't remember a certain amount of time and you're confused at where you are and what's happened. And like your brain all of a sudden connects what's happening and it's overwhelming. So, obviously not everybody feels lows the same. There's different symptoms. But basically too much insulin for the amount of
glucose in your
system.
As well. Yeah. And so balancing those two things, we'll hear a lot of this kind of conversation and things related to what is essentially balancing the amount of carbohydrates that then break down into glucose in your blood, and the amount of insulin that are going into your body at any given time. And that balancing act is
a lifelong journey.
Yeah. And sometimes you lose your balance for all kinds of reasons. So, that we have talked through a little bit about type 1 being then the physiological process where your immune system kills off the cells that create insulin. It does not kill the pancreas. So your organ is still there and functioning. It serves many other purposes besides this. But those cells that produce insulin, killed off.
Yep.
Type 2 diabetes then is another important conversation for us to have. For one thing, because type 2 diabetes is far more common of a diagnosis in the United States and the world.
And there's just such a wide gap for, where you are in that type 2 diagnosis. Some people take insulin, some people take medications. There's just so many different treatments for type 2 diabetics. and such a broader range of, diagnosis in type 2.
Yes.
Misdiagnosis in type 2 as well.
And that as well.
Which is, scary too.
Yeah. And, you mentioned before that every body has a different physiology. And so everybody's experience with a similar diagnosis is different. Every single experience is different.
Yep.
And that is obviously also true in the context of type 2. What's interesting here too is one of the key kind of identifiers is still the level of or the amount of glucose in your blood. Mm-hmm. And so that's usually the initial way of diagnosing diabetes regardless of type. And so that's also true here. In this case, however, we are not talking about the immune system killing off the cells in the pancreas that produce insulin.
Yeah.
Right. With type 2, there are two main processes going on. And for some, it's only one of these. For some, it's both. And so that's why treatment gets so really complicated and messy and navigating that in the day-to-day. So with type 2 diabetes, we're not necessarily talking about an absence of insulin production, but we are talking about, for one aspect of this is a reduction in the amount of insulin being produced by the pancreas.
Yeah. Not enough, or various amounts of decreased amounts for whatever reason. There's so many different reasons.
Exactly. And so lower insulin production means there's less insulin and therefore more glucose in the blood.
Yeah, right? And resistance to insulin is another factor as well.
That's number 2.
I jumped the gun.
You're good. Jump that gun.
So
jump it.
Your body resisting insulin, which is really frustrating too, for a lot of people with type 2.
Certainly so. And so on the one hand, individuals may be producing less. And so that has to be counteracted in some way to rebalance, as we're talking about this balancing act that people are doing every day. On the other side of that, we talked a little bit when we were talking about type 1 and highs and lows. The role of insulin is more or less to act as a key, to go to these cells in your body, to kind of open up a door, more or less, and to tell that cell, here's this glucose, use it for energy to actually perform the function that you need to in the body here. And so for those who experience insulin resistance, the insulin can't connect with those cells as easily.
Yeah.
And so the glucose still isn't getting in the cells. And that's the key here, right? And so with these two main factors going on to whatever extent for people with type 2, treatment gets really complicated. So for some, there are oral medications that can, for one thing, stimulate more production. So if that is, it turns out through all of the experimentation involved in figuring out what'll work, that's a conversation we're going to have with folks.
Yep.
Is the kind of like the way we have to kind of poke and prod our way around to figure out what's going to work and
figure out what's going to work, what doesn't work. And it's never ending. I mean, we've talked about the hormones and how they're always changing and always different as you grow and age. And it's a crazy ride.
Yeah. And on the outset of a diagnosis with type 2, there's no way to know for sure to what extent you are resistant and to what extent you are producing less insulin. It is through these long processes of messing around with different treatments that you find out what's working and what's not, and then can figure out what will work best. And so, so we do get into this territory now of the way that diagnosis, we need to understand what diagnosis even is.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about physicians reading people's bodies and experiences, in theory, their experiences as well, and then trying to make connections and define it.
Yeah.
Right?
Which is, can go very wrong.
Very complicated.
Misdiagnosis. I mean, Heather talked about her misdiagnosis for years or months. I don't know how long it was that they were.
I can't remember the time frame, but that's the point. The point is that doctor read her and her body and, importantly, her age and gender and said, no, it's not any of these other things. It is this particular condition because this is how I understand you as a person, right?
Yeah. I mean, and there are also people who aren't getting to the doctor because they don't have health care. I mean, we've mentioned a little bit about healthcare here in America and the tragedy that it is. So people, even if you are getting diagnosed or your doctor's saying, hey, look, this is what's going on, I can't afford this, I can't afford it. I can't afford to come to you every 3 months, which is a lot of times the requirement for like managing.
Oh, so expensive.
So especially when it's not as dire as, okay, you need insulin every day. With type 2, it's more long term. Like the effects of not taking care of yourself is a lot more long term. And so it's not immediate.
Right.
And so, when you have to choose between feeding your kids or treating this thing that is sort of hovering around you, what do you pick? You pick the most immediate need. And so there's a lot of people not getting the care they need or the help they need, which is really scary.
Right.
Because you do not feel good. You can't possibly feel good when your body is not, having the correct amounts of insulin.
Yeah, it is often miserable, frankly. Untreated diabetes is a miserable experience, and that misery looks different in different contexts. Along with what you're getting at here, I think it's important to point out that diagnosis related to type 2, we need to keep in the frame here, is a class related. Visuality, I guess you could say the way that type 2 is understood socially, culturally, in the large scale. Type 2 is classed, right? It is understood to be mapped onto the bodies of working class people.
Sure.
There are a lot of reasons for that we can get to in future episodes as well, but it's also really important to remember that it is also racialized.
Oh,
and again, the way that happens, the reasons for that, and the historical context wherein the bodies of Black and brown people are stigmatized and then identified within the realm of the medical is something we need to keep in mind as we're thinking through this.
Yeah.
So
that's a whole episode in itself.
100%.
Several episodes.
Several episodes will come.
There's so much to talk about.
We're going to roll through these for sure. But the key here is that these are the two most common diagnoses of diabetes. Type 2, far and away, the largest proportionally of people diagnosed with diabetes. Yep. We're talking a 10-fold difference between the number of diagnosis of type 2 compared to those of type 1. So, where we're talking about somewhere in the range of 3, a little bit more, million people in the U.S. diagnosed with type 1, we're talking over 30 million people in the U.S. diagnosed with type 2. And so that scale is also important as we are understanding how these things exist, not only as embodied experiences for people and a diagnosis in the context of medicine, but these have a social life too. These live in society and they're defined in really complicated ways.
Definitely.
So, along with those two main types, there are a number of other forms of diabetes that in some cases are still pretty common, and in other cases much less so, but important to at least mention. We can't go into the same amount of depth in this episode for all of these, but it's important to point these out.
Yeah.
And the first one would be gestational diabetes.
Yep.
Right. And in this case, we're talking about a diagnosis related to high blood glucose levels, either because of reduced, again, in a similar way that this functions with type 2, either related to a reduction in the production of insulin or resistance by the cells of the body.
In pregnant women.
During pregnancy. Hence the name, gestational. Okay. And there are a lot of things about gestational diabetes too that I think are really fascinating in the way that we understand what diabetes is and how it functions in people's bodies.
Yeah.
But also then the kind of cultural life of gestational diabetes, right? One of the things that is super common when gestational diabetes is narrated by people is the process by which they were diagnosed.
Oh my gosh.
Do you know what I'm referring to?
I don't know. Oh yeah, the drinking of the sugar drink.
Yes.
I didn't have to do that when I was pregnant because clearly I'm already diabetic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean you hear people talking about those orange sugar drinks that you have to drink and sit around and wait, and it's crazy. It's really nuts.
And so, they essentially have people drink a syrup, right? It's hyper sugared drink.
And then see how your body processes it, basically.
Yeah. And so then they do a urinalysis thereafter.
What's crazy is how late they do it in pregnancy. To me, I mean, I don't know if that's common everywhere, if there's different, I don't know, but it's pretty late in pregnant. I mean, not late, but it's not right at the beginning. And I don't know if it's because your body doesn't necessarily, I don't know.
Yeah. But what is insulin again? It's a hormone. And so as hormones change throughout pregnancy, to your point there, this can be triggered at any point during pregnancy. And, for many, after the baby is born, or after they are no longer pregnant, those processes rebalance and they no longer need to keep an eye on blood sugars.
Yeah, I mean, there's an amount of, keeping an eye on you while after you've delivered your baby to see. I mean, a lot of people then are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes afterwards. It just kind of depends, obviously, on you and your hormones and your particular situation. But
exactly. And so for some, it does rebalance. For others, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so that can be a triggering episode that then becomes a long-term chronic illness rather than the kind of bounded chronic illness within the context of pregnancy. And so that gets us into the realm of a number of other types of diagnosis, including LADA or LADA, latent autoimmune diabetes in adults. Is that what it is? Yeah. And is often referred to as type 1.5.
Yeah.
Right. And we will do an episode on type 1.5, LADA, LADA, however folks identify that for themselves. But the key here is that we are talking for most people, eventually for most, and that's where this gets a little bit different. Eventually the complete halt of production of insulin, much like people with type 1.
Like a slower process.
But a much slower process. And so it's not the same kind of autoimmune process that happens with type 1 that's triggered there. But in the end, results in similar experiences and the necessity of balancing insulin with injections and that kind of thing. So the other very common diagnosis here that is also in the large context fairly recent, modern a fairly recent diagnosis is pre-diabetes. And because this functions as a diagnosis, it is then something to be treated. And so there's some conversation to be had around where that line is drawn and how and when people are being tested of whether they may or may not be pre-diabetic as the diagnosis is identified. But it's basically a marker of, your insulin production or resistance is not to the kind of level that would qualify as type 2, but you may or may not, your body may or may not be headed in that direction.
Yeah.
Right. And so for some, this diagnosis is very helpful in that it helps them, again, try and rebalance things so that their body actually feels like they can embody it.
Sure.
Right. For some, this also functions as a little bit of a scare tactic, and that's where this gets really messy. And the way it's racialized and classed and things like that. So there are a number of other forms of diabetes, type 3C, which we'll have to come back to in future episodes, monogenic diabetes. There are other forms that are related to other diseases and chemical experiences in the body. So cystic fibrosis related diabetes, a drug or chemical induced diabetes for some that are either from recreational use or pharmaceutical use for treating various conditions. That kind of thing can happen. And then also what is referred to as MODY, which is an interesting designation, but maturity onset diabetes of the young. Super weird name, but we'll have to unpack that in a future episode. Again, these are important diagnoses to keep in the frame here, and we'll have to do individual episodes to talk through these in more depth.
Okay, so before we wrap up, we're going to talk about a little bit about treatments and some of the terminology and language around those treatments. I think most of them are probably pretty self-explanatory, but there is some lingo that goes into it that you'd probably be fine not knowing what it is. You could probably put the pieces together, but it's interesting to kind of connect the dots on some of the things we're talking about.
Yeah. And in the context of treatment for diabetes, the long history of treatment prior to the last 100 years and since, really, still, but certainly for the thousands of years prior to 100 years ago when the first shot of insulin was administered to a patient, the primary means by which people could in any way treat diabetes, regardless of type and physiological experience, was through diet changes.
Yeah.
And importantly, abstaining. So like abstention in general
from certain foods
is a long-term kind of, and in some cases from like all food, which is so
horrifying.
We'll talk about, we'll have to have an episode about kind of life with diabetes prior to 1920 and 1921 when pharmaceutical insulin was introduced. Because it's misery. I mean, we're talking about
it's
misery.
pretty much a death sentence.
Certainly so. And so that gets us into the realm of, okay, so what are the primary forms of treatment then today?
Insulin, obviously.
Number one, insulin. Insulin injection in one form or another into the body, used as a means of introducing that hormone into the system, either where it's not in any level or where there's not enough of it or there's a lot of resistance in the body. So if there's more insulin in there and the body is resistant to it, then in theory, the excess of insulin can at least get some of that sugar through, right? So that gets kind of messy, but insulin injection.
Yeah, I mean, there's shots where you have a vial of insulin and you drop a needle and inject it into your body. This is how I started out when I was 9 years old. Insulin pumps were obviously around. When I was young, they weren't giving them to children at that point.
Certainly not.
There was a lot of scare of like delivering insulin without knowing. Anyway, so when I was diagnosed, I don't even think I knew about insulin pumps. I mean, when
They
you're
were
a
not
kid,
circulating widely at that point.
no. So, I mean, I basically gave myself shots. There's long-term insulin, short-term insulin, basically enters your body and triggers, different amounts of time. So, I mean, I was basically giving myself a shot in the morning and then like insulin when I ate food. So that was kind of one way. There's Insulin Pens, which came into my life in my teenage years, which were really big for me because I was always really embarrassed about like going out to eat. There's all these little things that you don't realize until you have it, like drawing up insulin in a needle, and there's so much like stigma into needles and drug use and stuff. And so insulin pens were a lot more hideable, which as a teenager I liked to not feel different. And so that was pretty big for me. Obviously insulin pumps are more so that way because you just click some buttons. You're not even, drawing up insulin, but insulin pens basically have the insulin vial inside of them. And so you just switch out the needle tip and drop the certain amount of insulin and
inject it right there from the pen.
Insulin pumps, obviously, you drop the insulin into the insulin pump, insert a tube into your body that stays there for several days, some longer. I guess it depends on the pump that you have. But then can deliver you insulin pretty much all day long, which, slowly during the day, you can kind of adjust when you need more or less insulin, which is a really cool technology.
Yeah. And so insulin pumps then with those little micro doses throughout the day take the place of the long acting or the slow release insulins that have been a staple in treatment for somewhere in the range of 20 years, pushing 30 years as well. This whole setup of multiple daily injections as a means of kind of maintaining levels or balancing was conceptualized many decades prior to the advent of these devices. And that's a whole conversation. We need to talk about Richard Bernstein because there's a lot of really interesting and complicated things going on in relation to him and his work. But he kind of pioneered that model that is now kind of standard within insulin pump use.
Sure.
So for people with type 1 diabetes, that's it. Insulin's the only way to do that. You can't stimulate the cells that have died.
Yeah.
And so insulin's it. Injection is the only way to do it. For people with type 2, there are some oral medications that can do that stimulating work, either stimulating the pancreas to produce more or stimulating the body's cells to accept the insulin that can open the door for the glucose to get in there. And there are a ton of oral medications for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. And it has flooded the market in a way that has, frankly, preyed on a lot of vulnerable people as well. And so that's a complicated mess as well. But navigating those oral meds is tricky. Like we were talking about, it's a process of trial and error.
Yep. As with a lot of, medications on the market today, what's going to work for you, what medications are going to work best. So it gets really complicated and difficult to kind of hone in on what's going to work for your body. And it's not always going to be the same. It's ever changing. And a lot of people have to use oral medication and insulin, which is even more complicated and crazy to try and navigate. So,
yeah. And so like the amounts of insulin to inject and when and how that's balancing with these stimulating oral meds and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, it gets very, very complicated. And I think this is what Dr. Walker was also referring to a little bit in that conversation from the last episode. Because she was saying for folks with type 1, it's insulin, and there is a complicated mess involved in trying to figure out the balance and
like
how that
how much
changes day to day.
insulin for what you're eating, and it's different for everybody. There's
and
not
exercise
like
and stress, and when it's a day that you are, at work for X number of hours versus a different number of hours in a different way. All of these.
and if you're standing versus sitting, and if you're
Yeah, it's so many things. But
if you're
it's
sad that day.
it's just the balance of insulin and food.
Yep.
In that process, for folks with type 2 who are bringing in all of these various medications that are doing different things to their hormone systems, their endocrine systems in their body, it gets really difficult, and it's a complex web to kind of navigate. So, in order to know though what to inject and when and how much and all of that, it has also become standard practice for people with diabetes now, basically whatever type, to be testing their blood glucose levels regularly.
Yep.
For most, that means several times a day. For some people, that will mean once or twice a day. But daily, we are talking about somewhere in the range of close to 90% of people with a diabetes diagnosis test with a blood glucose meter every day.
Yep.
And this is in the context of the United States. We got to keep that in the frame too.
Yeah.
But that's important because that old finger prick is really widely understood as a part of diabetes and a part of living with and treating diabetes. And so what we're talking about is a lanceting device that pokes the finger and a little bit of blood can come out. Okay. And
or spray you in the face.
Or spray you in the face. Or if you happen to be or if you're wearing a white shirt that day, it will spray on that white shirt, right?
It's funny when when I was, what grade was this? 6th grade, I think. I remember a recess in which I was trying to convince all my friends to test their blood to know what it was like. And some of them were really like intrigued by doing it. And one of my friends was like sobbing. She was so afraid of it. And I was like, come on. And I think it was my way of like being like, this is what I deal with every day. Like, and trying to show them like, yeah, it sucks. But like, think about doing it every day, like 5+ times, or, you test your blood and you forget to calibrate your pump and then you have to test again, So I don't know why that memory popped into my head, but I hope some of my friends are listening and remember that.
Oh, that's great.
Me trying to test their blood at school.
Yes. But this is important because if you don't know where your body is in a particular moment, then eating more carbs can skyrocket what is already an elevated blood glucose level, and injecting insulin for food when one is already quite low can drop people dramatically. So having a sense of where you are is invaluable.
It is really interesting too. After years of having diabetes, you kind of know how you feel in certain situations, but there are times when I feel super low and then I test and I'm not. And so it's like,
right.
Wow, this is weird because I thought I was low. And if you just treat that without knowing, that can be really dangerous too.
Yeah.
So along with that, if you have something on your hands, like you were touching baking and have sugar all over your hands and you test, like that affects your blood sugar that comes up on the meter. So, having clean hands and, do you wash your hands every time you test your blood? I mean, realistically, no.
Yeah, right.
I mean, come on. Let me go wash my hands when I'm in the, like, I just need to test, So It's kind of interesting, the things that you deal with.
For sure.
With blood testing, but.
And so, this, the advent of finger prick blood glucose testing has been massive in being able to understand what's happening in people's bodies in particular moments. But that's what it is.
Yep.
It's a snapshot in a particular moment. And this is where we get into the realm of continuous glucose monitors, or CGMs. So you may hear that term thrown around, a CGM or a sensor. Some people may just call it a Dexcom because that's the most widely circulating one. And a continuous glucose monitor is intended to try and take these little snapshots every few minutes and then map them out for people. And so then we're talking about creating trajectories, rising, falling, whatever it may be, so that in theory, people can make treatment decisions about what is happening and not just based on this one little snapshot that the finger prick is.
Yeah.
And I think, as we talked about in the first episode, the CGM has been possibly even more significant to the changes in how your treatment functions.
The CGM was life-changing for me, especially when you can see where your blood sugar's going, and kind of try and counteract it. Before that, if you're testing your blood, let's say 5 times a day, you test every time you eat, and then in between, sometimes 2 hours after your meals, to kind of get a base of what your numbers are. So you have 5 blood sugars that during the day. What's happening in between that?
Right.
You could have a total spike and then come down and not know that your blood sugars are spiking, because if you're testing and then sleeping all night, you don't know that you had this intense spike and that your body kind of corrected it after a while. But so that's a really interesting, it's been life-changing for me, for sure.
Yeah.
In my ability to keep my blood sugars more level, and A1C being lower. So
yep. And so that's the short version of the introduction to diabetes and their treatments. There are a number of different experiences related to diabetes, and that's the key. And there are a number of treatments that get at those different experiences.
Yeah. Things we haven't even talked about, inhalable insulin is kind of a newer thing on the market. Or you were talking about air shots.
Air shots.
I didn't even know about.
Yeah. And so it uses intense puffs of air to inject the insulin through the skin without the use of a needle. So for people who have serious needle phobias around the use of needles and syringes, it actually makes it possible to inject their insulin that they can't get otherwise. So yeah, there are a number of these things, and a number of CGMs that don't have to be calibrated, and there's all kinds of fancy things you can tap with your phone, and then it gives you a reading from there. It's really fascinating and remarkable and overwhelming amount of things going on here that I think as we go in future episodes, we can kind of thicken out this primer.
Access to these things obviously is the biggest number one thing to talk about, I think, because, this life-changing thing is only available through access to these things, and they are not cheap. They're not accessible to everybody, which, is really unfair.
To be frank, these things are very expensive. The real horror is that a month's worth of insulin is almost as expensive as many of these devices. And so the inaccessibility of the actual life-saving pharmaceutical is, I think, the key to all of that, because the insulin pump is useless if there's no insulin.
Yeah.
And if you know where your blood glucose is in a given moment, but you don't have insulin to actually inject to counteract some of that, then it's also useless, right? Yeah. And so we will have serious conversations about the lack of access.
All right, so that wraps up episode 3, our diabetes primer. We also talked about our everything seasoning pumpkin
bread. Yeah, I know. The name is kind of ridiculous, okay?
We should have workshopped that a little bit. Anyway, thanks for being with us. Follow us on Instagram and all where you get your podcasts.
Yep, and we do have a new page up on Facebook, and we exist on Twitter technically, but don't do much there. So we're around.
Steve's in charge of Twitter.
Yeah, we're around. So come join us next week. We will have a special guest, and I'm really excited for this one. We're not going to tease it in the same way that we have in the previous episodes, but it's going to be fantastic.
We're excited to continue giving you more episodes every week. So subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a review if you feel like. Ask us questions. If you have terms that you have questions about or things you want to hear more about, let us know. If you'd like to join us on an episode, we'd love to hear from you in the future.
Absolutely. And thank you all very much.